Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics. Welcome to episode 6 of Mixing Loud with Clip to Zero. In this video, I'm finally explaining what it means to clip from the top, which is the secret sauce for making sounds loud enough to fit into a loud mix. Before I start, just a quick reminder, this is part of an ongoing playlist that I'm building out. I recommend if you're going to talk about this method with other people in your forums and Discord channels and whatever, maybe point them to the playlist instead of individual videos in the playlist. That way they can see the full context, learn the whole thing from beginning to end. There's a whole lot of content still coming in this series. We're only on episode 6 here. A lot more things I'm going to be talking about. And I just want to give you a little bit of a warning up front. I talked about saturating in the last episode. I'm talking about clipping from the top in this episode. And you may be tempted to think, now I know everything. I'm ready to run off and use this. I'd like you to hold your horses for a little bit and wait until I at least get through these topics here. Because there's a lot more to it than just these simple mechanics of saturating from the bottom and clipping from the top. There's things you need to understand about how all the clippers interact with each other as they move up from every track through the buses to your master. There's tricks about adjusting that cascade of clippers so you can hit any loudness target. There's tricks about how loud do I set the anchor and framework sounds in my project so that I'm going to hit a target loudness I want to get to. There's maybe some considerations for how to level each new sound you add to the product into your existing clipper cascade and mix framework. So there's a few more topics you really need to build the whole picture for you. And even after that point, I'm going to be going into some other interesting side notes about this whole method. So hang in there. We'll get to all this soon enough. So for today's episode, again, we're talking about controlling the dynamic range by clipping from the top. If you haven't yet seen the previous episode about saturating from the bottom, I recommend you go check that out. That's episode 5. And I'm going to point out you don't want to do this clipping until you've done your sound design, usually, although you can kind of iterate on this, and I'll show you how you can iterate. The main thing to remember as we start, before I really start showing you this, is always, always, always remember you don't want to clip more than you need to get a sound loud enough to fit into your mix. You're going to find that you can clip a lot of sounds really aggressively and it will seem very, very transparent, and it will be transparent. So you could clip a sound to be really loud and then just fader down that already mashed sound into your mix. And that's okay, but why add more clipping distortion to your project than you need to, right? So I'm going to be showing you a little bit of fine nuance I've never talked about before, which is, after you figure out the breaking point for a clipper, you might still want to pull it back far from that breaking point because you just don't need to push it that loud to fit into the context of your mix. So we're going to talk about that. And just always remember, like limiters, clippers don't like to work. So the less you work them, the less hard you make them work, the better the overall result's going to be, especially when you've got lots of different tracks across your project and lots of different buses all performing certain amounts of clipping. The other thing to remember is that unlike with saturating from the bottom, where your goal is to change and color the sound, the clipping from the top part needs to be super transparent. Your goal is to be as transparent as possible, and it really is possible. But it's just a little bit of a heads up. You don't want to go overboard and do too much clipping to the point where you're starting to hear it. Okay, so let's get right into it. This is my standard project template. I have a few basic sounds in here I use for quickly grabbing songwriting ideas. So I have a kick and a snare. And you can see, if I've showed you this meter before, but just to remind people that are seeing this for the first time, these white lines at the outer edge represent 0 dB full scale. So you can see my kick is already going right up to the limit at 0 dBFS. My blue colored snare is a little quieter. The fat part of the waveform looks like it's about 3 dB below RMS. But if I were to flip over to a mixer mode, what was that snare actually measuring? The snare's got a few really short transient peaks hitting as high as negative 1.8. Okay, but the point is it's not even hitting 0 yet. It's overlap with the kick at this part. And in fact, if I show you what these two signals look like when they're added together or summed together, you can see that the combined kick and snare hit is going way over 0, at least as far as about, let's see, you got to look at the number way over on the right. It's going about 4 dB over 0 in general, that combined hit. So already at my drum bus here, where the kick and the snare are summing together and making this summed amount of whatever, this bus clipper is already clipping 4 dB off the kick and the snare, that combined hit. But you can't hear it because, again, it's clipped to 0 and everything's transparent. And, you know, I've already checked that for you. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a knocky kick. It's a mid-tempo-y kind of white noisy snare. This is a perfect, easy on my ears bed for creating new projects. So I always tend to start with this. And then later I may, you know, decide to pick different kicks and snares for the song as it develops and I decide what direction I want it to go in. All right, so I also have a sub bass. Here's just a simple 4 on the floor pattern to go along with the kick and the snare. And as you can hear, the kick, snare, and sub are all in a good relative balance with each other. The sub is hitting about 6 dB below peak, below 0 rather, and it's nicely balanced with the kick and the snare. It's nice and fat and heavy for bass-oriented music like I tend to produce. And so this is the framework in which I write my songs, this starting framework. Sounds may change over time. I may change my sub. I may change my kick. I may change my snare, but they're all going to be roughly this loud. And it's set up this way because I know from using my method, this will land me songs right at -7 to -6 LUFS every time. By the time I bring in other sounds and mix them into this framework, my mix will be hitting -7, -6, no problem, without any mastering limiter, any mastering chain, anything in the mix. So let's demonstrate that. I've got a few basic sounds here. Let's start with a simple bass driver sound that since I write mid-tempo bass, I use a lot of rolling bass sounds. And this is just one default sound I use to find a melody or a hook for a driving pattern I want. So let's turn this one on and let's play it along with the kick and the snare and let you hear what it sounds like. All right, sounds good, right? Sounds balanced. If anything, that sounds probably too loud for this particular. I would probably take this thing down by, I don't know, maybe another 3 dB. So if I pull up dP meter on my listen bus, so this is listening to what's effectively happening at the master track, you can see this was hitting 5.7 LUFS. These 4 sounds, kick, snare, sub, and that one rolling bass is hitting 5.7 LUFS. Let's actually turn on the midline there. That's what the rolling bass looks like and how it's hitting. And I'm not even side chaining it against my kick yet. I could turn on my side chainers just so that that looks a little better. Okay, you can see what the waveforms look like. If we zoom in here, you can see that I'm side chaining out the sub and the mid bass rolling bass sound. I'm leaving space here just for the kick and the snare. so they're not too much peaking here in this area. And, you know, that shows that the summing isn't getting too out of hand. So the whole thing's hitting negative 5.7 LUFS. No limiter, no mastering chain. It's already ridiculously loud. Let's bring this particular sound back closer to where I might really put it. Let's drop it about 3.5 dB. It's probably going to be about right. Let's see what this sounds like. Okay. So we're right close to 7.4. If I were to bring this up just another dB or two, I'd be right at 7 LUFS. So the point is, it's very simple and easy to hit very competitive loudness levels without mashing all your sounds through a mastering limiter and screwing them up. Let's look really closely at what the total combined signal of all these sounds looks like. This is the listen bus, so this is effectively the master. Clear everything out. Do this one more time. Let's go ahead and bop this up just a tinch. All right, there we go. Stop this. Now let's just zoom in and take a look at what's going on. Remember, this is my kick, snare, and of course the kick and the snare are combined here, so it's going way over 0. But all my clippers on my buses and tracks, you know, all the individual sounds are being clipped. The buses where they sum together are clipping even more because they combine and make bigger peaks. So does this look like a terrible, horrible, distorted, sausaged waveform to you? I don't think so. Let's look at this first kick. Okay, we've got the tiniest bit of clipping right here on these 2 hits of the kick's tail. By the time we get to here, it's back to normal again. The whole first part of the kick, perfectly normal. These are incredibly short transient kicks. They're not hurting the sound of the kick in any way. All right? Let's keep looking a little further along the waveform. No clipping here. All right, let's zoom in and look at the combined kick and snare hit. So again, the kick and the snare, it's a high frequency sound being combined with a lower frequency sound. These few places here are a little more exaggerated with the clipping, but we can see there's a lot of high frequency detail still happening along, you know, the top of the kick. Okay. And again, it's a very short ephemeral. There's like 3 wave cycles that are slightly clipped. But the rest of the waveform, everything to do with the sub and the rolling bass line, there's no clips here. Maybe one tiny little super ephemeral clip right here. It's hard to get zoomed in far enough to see that. Maybe a little tiny clip right there. So there's a little bit of clipping. But it's not like it's this massively sausaged waveform. Let's look at these 2 peaks right here. See, there's no serious, significant clips of any sort there. That looks perfectly normal. So this is little over 7 LUFS, straight out of the mix. Haven't done any final shaping on it with a mastering limiter to try and maybe minimize some of these clip sections, put a little bit more of a slope on them. And as I pointed out in episode 4, where I talked about does clipping hurt speaker drivers, right? These kind of short, tiny, ephemeral, full DC events on my kick drum, they're so short and ephemeral. That's not going to be contributing to any significant extra heat generation in the voice coils of the subarray. It's just not. It's too short. It's too ephemeral. There's plenty of movement still happening in those subarrays, right? And normal music is going to be like this. If you're not doing something weirdly artificial with, like, I don't know, a track that is 60% massive squashed 808s with huge, long, flat top sections of DC, right? Unless you're doing something really, really weirdly artificial like that, that isn't going to be all that musical, you don't run any risk of hurting speaker systems, even in big clubs, okay? Now, it is possible. There's a reason people like Dan Worrell do sometimes gripe about that, because I've seen some pretty silly stuff done. But I'm trying to teach you not to do that. I'm trying to teach you to think about your waveforms. And when you do a lot of little bits of clipping earlier in the summing cascade, by the time it rolls up to the final master, you see things that are a lot more like this, where any kind of clips you see are very short and ephemeral, and the vast majority of your waveform looks perfectly normal with plenty of movement for all your drivers, right? Your subarray all throughout this section, except for these two little short millisecond events in the tail of the kick, all this stuff here is perfectly normal sub movement, even on your subarray by the time this has been low passed out. There's nothing here that's going to damage anything. So this is a very safe method. Let's show you how we actually go about doing this now. I think the easiest way to demo this would be to start with the original sounds, and I'm going to show you just the clipper portion. Now, what you're looking at here, I work in Bitwig. Ableton and Bitwig people have the ability to make really, really fancy, complex processing racks that are full of all kinds of different plugins and native DAW devices, and we save them in a little package that can just be dragged out of our library. So that's what you see here. This is my little pre-built rack for doing clip to zero on a track. What it is in essence, though, is what we call a CTZ pair. So on your tracks, your individual tracks where the sound sources are, where the sound generators are, you want a CTZ pair. And what that comprises, I'll just add them in manually. DP meter, followed by K-clip. You can ignore everything else you see in my rack for now. We're going to talk about that in the next few episodes. So just these two plugins is a clip to zero pair. On a bus, you don't need DP meter. On a bus, I would just have K-clip. But in a track, you want that DP meter in front of it, and I'll be showing you why in just a second. So we're going to leave the DP meter alone for a second, and I'm just going to show you the clipper part. So this sound, this rolling bass sound, you can see that it's being clipped by about almost 9 dB. I'm driving it into the headroom, or the threshold of the clipper at 0 dB full scale. So I'm driving the peaks past it by 8 dB. And I'm going to turn the clipper, well, I need to do this. Let's take this also down to 8.7 to normalize it. Okay, so now I've linked the input and the output. It sounds like this. And let's turn up the listen bus a bit. So that's with the clipper on, right? Now I'm going to turn it off. Do you hear any difference? All right. There is a difference. You can clearly see it in these big spiky things. It sounds a little more pokey, a little more clicky, a little more spiky. And that's normal. The point is, you're only noticing it and thinking of it as worse or somehow different because you're hearing the original at last. Right? When I was first playing this to you, it sounded like a perfectly normal rolling bass line. It sounded like it had plenty of transient movement to it. In fact, I would argue this patch coming straight out of Serum is a little bit too clicky, a little bit too transient. Those transients are a little sharp and harsh in a bad way, and it actually sounds better to smooth them out a little bit with the clipping. Check it out. Now here's where we get into a certain amount of subjective judgment call territory. Some of you may go, oh my God, where's the dynamics? Where's the clickiness? Where's the pokiness? It's a plucky sounding rolling bass. It should sound plucky. Well, yes and no. That's a judgment call. That's a sound design decision. What I will tell you is that if this clipper isn't active, it's not loud enough to fit into this framework. Again, I'm going to set this back to its normal volume. Let's take the listen bus back down so I don't blow your ears out. So here it is again. Now, if I turn off the clipper entirely, so I've just turned it off, here's what it's going to sound like against my framework for my mix, comprising the kick, the snare, and the sub. This is what all the sounds have to get loud enough to fit into, or my song's not going to hit my competitive loudness for this genre of 7/11. Here's the kick and the snare. Right? It's just not loud enough. So you have to make it loud. And what's important to remember is anytime you strive for loudness, I talked about this in episode 2. Every time you strive for loudness, you have to make some compromises with your sound design choices, your arrangement choices, your mixing choices. Loudness always involves a little bit of compromise, a little bit of trade-off. The key to being a good producer, especially if you're going to work in loud genres, is knowing where that sweet spot is in the trade-off between perfect fidelity of the original sound versus good enough for somehow doing things to the sound to make it loud enough to fit into a small dynamic range and therefore a loud mix. There will always be compromises. Clipping will, to some degree, hurt your sound, one way or another. In this case, it's taking that pokey transient, sharp, edgy, plucky feel of the transients. And again, this is how your brain will trick you. You'll start with a given sound and you'll go, okay, well, it sounds great, but it's not loud enough. So let me do the things Baffy's teaching me about saturating from the bottom, clipping from the top. And then you might scratch your head and go, I wonder how this sounds compared to the original version of the sound. And you'll go, wait a minute, it sounds different a little bit, right? I'm losing some of that pokey, dynamic, transient edge to the sound. And I hear all these YouTube videos out there saying, oh my God, dynamics are better. If you get rid of the dynamics, if you squash the dynamics, it's not going to sound as loud to people. And you get all these competing viewpoints about what is loudness. And there's this constant message out there right now from a certain faction saying more dynamics is always louder. It's always perceived as louder. And I will argue, no, it's not. That's microdynamics, not macrodynamics. There's all these other factors that have to do with perceived loudness. And dynamics, microdynamics, is not really that much of a factor. It just isn't. Punchy isn't always louder. Punchy is punchy. It's not loud, it's punchy. That's two different things. So yeah, by clipping this waveform to make it loud enough, let's turn the clipper on again. See, we've clipped those transients a little bit. We've made those transients a little less punchy, isn't quite the right word. It's less pokey, it's less prickly, but we'll use punchy as a generalization here, right? We've made this particular sound a tiny bit less punchy, but we haven't changed the essential timbre of the sound. It's still the same synth as before. The dynamics are slightly different. So we've compromised the dynamics a little bit to make it loud enough to fit into the mix. And if you hadn't heard the beginning sound with those extra dynamics in it to start with, you wouldn't know anything was wrong. You didn't hear anything wrong with the sound when I was first demoing it to you and showing that it fit into the mix. And this is the key. This is the thing you have to get your brain around. Clipping is okay. The point is to find the balance where it's not too bad, where it's mostly transparent, where if you hadn't heard the original sound beforehand, you wouldn't know, you wouldn't think anything was wrong. You'd say, oh, it's a perfectly good sound. It fits in the mix great. Okay? That's what you're going to have to get your head around if you're going to work loud and if you're going to compete in loud genres. Okay, I think I've hammered on that point enough. Now let's hear what's actually happening to the sound. K-Clip has this nice feature where you can hear a delta. What that means is it's going to invert out the normal sound and show you what kind of distortion is being created because of the sudden clipping that we're doing. We're doing about 8 dB of clipping. What does it sound like? Let's push this button right here and see what it sounds like. Okay, it's just these little short spitty clicks, right where the original transient spikes were. And it's the nature of this particular sound that the sound itself masks this distortion. If anything, the distortion adds a little bit of that pokey, prickly clickiness back into the track, despite the fact that we're squashing those transients a little bit with the clipper. Let's hear it again in context with everything. I mean, it's essentially the same as before. So in the context of the full mix, all right. So I think you get that point. So that's kind of the philosophical talk and the technical talk about hows and whys, and don't go too far, don't go too less. Now let's talk about mechanics. Let's talk about actually doing this with a different kind of sound. I kind of don't want to do this with a rolling bass. Let's pick this piano sound instead. So here I have a typical piano sound for composing chords. Right? And it's just designed to be really loud compared to the kick and the snare. It's also, you know, if I were to measure all that together, it'd be around -6 LUFS again. It's just a songwriting tool. It's a piano sound that makes my chord feels really clear to me as I'm picking out harmonics, progressions for the song. I've also got a pluck sound that I use for melodic stuff, but we'll just focus on this piano for a second. So again, this piano is clipped. To get this far, to get this loud, if I were to turn off the clipper, this is what it would sound like. Versus all right, so how much are we clipping that? About 5 dB. And you can see from the waveform here, it's not like it's turning the piano into a sausage or anything. Still plenty of dynamics, still plenty of transient, you know, edge on that. So we're clipping it by 4 or 5 dB, depending on how hard a velocity I'm playing. What's the actual clipping sound like underneath? Let's turn on this wet knob again. All right, you can see the little spits. I was playing those really hard. You couldn't even hear those. Tiniest little clicks, tiniest little spits. But we're clipping that much off the waveform so we can push it up closer to 0, right on top of 0, and get it loud enough to fit in this mix. We've increased it by, 5.2 dB, which is exactly what it needs. And yet the clipping on these tiny little ephemeral transients and the attack of this piano, you can't even hear the clipping, not even when we delta it out, right? You can't hear that clipping. Right? I played that just as loud, just as hard. You can't even hear those little spits from the clipping. Okay, so clipping is not your enemy. Clipping saves lives. It's wonderful. It helps you get loud. So the trick is finding a sound that can be clipped transparently, so you don't hear it, and therefore can be pushed loud enough. Now, one thing about clip to zero and one thing about working this way and clipping every new sound that comes in, because your framework is already set up to be loud enough for the genre you're working in. I work in bass heavy festival music, so I need to work around 7 lefts minimum, right? So I've got my kick, snare, and subs set up to work out that way. So all my sounds, if they're not loud enough to fit into that framework of the kick, snare, and sub, that's not a good sound. I have to throw it away and pick a different sound. And by forcing myself to clip it right at the get-go to get it loud enough, I'm testing early whether or not that sound even belongs in a loud mix. Because a lot of them don't. You're going to pick some sounds at first, and then you clip them, and you're going to go, wow, that sounds really bad when I start clipping them. Well, you're going to have to throw that sound out, and pick a different sound. That's what I meant in episode 2 when I said loudness always involves a compromise. If you need to work in a loud genre, you're going to be more constrained in your choice of sound design, mixing, and arrangement. You're going to have to make your mix be loud. If you do something that isn't meant to be loud and then you hammer it through a bunch of clippers and limiters, it's just going to turn into hammered mush. Okay? So this is part of why we work this way. Test early, fail fast. If the sound works, great. If the sound doesn't work, it doesn't. Let's duplicate this now with some other sounds. And now I'm going to show you the actual mechanics of the DP meter and clipper thing. I'm just going to get rid of this track, my original rack entirely, and we're just going to bring in DP meter. And I'm going to turn off sync because that's tied to the DAW transport. I need to just be able to hear sounds coming. We'll also bring in K-clip. And then finally, let's bring up the original synth itself, which is Pigments, and let's pick a different piano sound. So let's start with, okay, this one called Glitch Box. Why not? I have no idea what it sounds like. All right, so let's hear this piano. All right, it's got some reverb on it, but it's not too bad. But it's clearly too quiet. Not nearly loud enough. All right, so again, let's reset our meter, bang a couple chords. All right, so hitting with a fairly hard velocity, my peaks are at -12. Let's click this button to gain it up by 12. This is what it sounds like now. Now that sounds to my ear like it's already loud enough. I may not even need to clip this one. For kind of a backing chord instrument, that's already loud enough. So just by normalizing it to 0, I didn't even need to clip that sound. Let's pick a different one. Because again, don't clip if you don't have to. Let's pick a key sound to 0. Too quiet. So let's reset this. All right, peaks hitting around -11, normalize it up to 0. Oh, that's already loud enough. So again, depending on the sound source, you may not even need to clip. This is a point I want to drive home in this video. Don't clip if you don't have to. Let's find a different sound. Let's go for a, I don't know, some sequence sound. Okay, it's not really loud enough yet. But again, if we reset this, find out where the peaks are hitting. All right, so the loudest peaks I'm able to measure is -5.9. Let's click that to normalize it up to 0. Try it against the drums. Ooh, that's got a bunch of scaling stuff built into it, so that sounded terrible. That's not loud enough. So let's take it up a little bit. Turn this on. I can tell just by looking at the waveform there's a lot of pokey transients, so I can probably clip it pretty heavily without hearing a difference. Let's try it in this high register. All right, I'm definitely hearing the sound change by the time I get up close to 12 dB of clipping, so clearly that's too much. Let's find a spot where we barely start to hear it change. I think around 8 dB, I'm not hearing much of a difference. Let's test that by A-Bing this on and off. Sounds pretty much the same. Again, with a really good ear, you can hear we're losing a little bit of those pokey, prickly dynamics, but is that really bad if it helps us get this sound as loud as it needs to be, right? Let's hear what the distortion actually sounds like on this one. Turning on the wet knob. Okay, now that's pretty heavy distortion. You're hearing it actually sound tonal. You're hearing tones in that, right? It's not just a spit. So that might be, you might say, wow, that's a lot of distortion. But again, do you really hear it when it's being masked by all the stuff going on in the original signal? See, it doesn't sound that much different, okay? It's certainly a lot louder. Let's find out. Let's turn off the link, double-click this to set it back to 0, and now let's hear it in context with the drums. Ah, perfect. I wanted to get to one of these so I could show you this. So we pushed it to its breaking point. We pulled it back a little bit. We A-B'd it on and off, and we said, it sounds pretty much the same. But it doesn't need to be this loud. When we finally, turn off the linking and set it back to see how loud the sound really is now, it's way loud compared to the kick and the snare. It doesn't need to be this loud. I don't need to clip it this much. Okay? So let's just use this like a secondary fader at this point. When you do this test against your mix and go, wow, it's super loud. Doesn't need to be that loud. Don't leave it clipped like this and go over to your track fader and pull your track fader down. Don't do that. Why leave all this clipping in here if it's not necessary? Let's back it off even more. Pull it down out of the clippers until it's just loud enough for the mix. It's right where we need it to be. So let's try that. Now, I'd argue that's even still too loud for the mix, but let's just say, for example, this section of the song, I really needed that to be in your face. There were other things going on, and it just needed to sit right out on top of the mix. So I might leave it clipped by this amount. And here, it's hardly clipping at all anymore. We just gave it a little bit of a nudge. So the point is, you can do this test, but don't leave it overclipped if it doesn't need to be overclipped. I could go on and I could pick lots of different sounds out of my hat and go through this process on each one, but I think you see the general pattern now. So the idea is always start with dP meter on your source sound, on your tracks, whether it's a sample, whether it's a synthesizer, whether it's something coming out of a sampler instrument, doesn't matter. Find the peaks, normalize them to 0 with dP meter. If it's loud enough at that point, great. Don't even bother with the clipper, even though it might be sitting there. You might need it later. Because if you put in some sound design processing, you might find that you do need to start clipping it. Like, in fact, let's do that. Let's do Pro Q3. Actually, I don't want to do it there. I want to do it in front of the pair. So right here, we're going to put in Pro Q3. So let's say I want to bracket this sound because it's a mid-rangey sound and I want it to focus much more on the higher end. I don't want it competing with my bass, bassy sounds, my mid basses. Let's say for some reason I want this region of the sound. Okay, now here, I've taken away a lot of the energy on the bottom end of the sound and the top end of the sound, so it's going to be a little bit quieter than before. Is it loud enough now? Actually, now it's right in the sweet spot. It's not too loud anymore. But the point is, if for some reason doing various moves like that, if I had done some sort of pre-processing to this sound that made it quieter in volume, that's when you might come back to your clipper and your dP meter and retake measurements, right? So originally, we had the gain set like this, but how does this sound measure now, right? If I measure it again, let's reset it. See, the peaks are a little quieter than before after putting on that EQ curve. So I could just normalize it again by clicking this one more time. And now we bumped up the gain by another 1.3 dB. Now it's pretty close to 0, close enough, right? It's a little louder than before. So, you know, every time you do processing on the sound, come back and recheck. You're normalizing to 0, and then you're clipping past 0. If for some reason the processing makes it too loud or too quiet compared to before, like if I came in here and put, I don't know, a Spectre on here. Let's say after the, helps if I could type today. After I did that EQ bracketing, let's say I also wanted to just kind of beef up the warmth of this sound a little bit. Okay, so let's say I wanted to add a little of that mid-range warmth to this sound. Now, I need to reset and check my peaks one more time. So now with that change in Spectre, it's now going almost 3 dB over 0, which means I've pushed this signal 3 dB more into the clipper. Well, I don't want to do that. First, I want to normalize this back to 0 by clicking the momentary button or the match button. And so that brought the gain down. So now, and synthesizers can be really variable with all their modulation going on. I still caught one more stray peak over 0. 4.3, 0.5 over. Click this one more time. See, that brought that down to 3.8. So you just kind of test a couple times. And make sure your peaks are close to 0, but not over 0. That's all you're really shooting for. Just get it close to 0. Then you can double check your clipping and say, do I still need this much clipping? Let's try it in the framework of my whole mix again. All right, well, for that kind of sound and what I'd probably use it for, it's still plenty loud enough. In fact, I may even decide I don't need any clipping at all on it. Or, all depends on the sound, I might need to clip it more because suddenly it's too quiet, even after renormalizing things back to 0. So you see the pattern here. DP meter to normalize, K clip to get it where it needs to be. And if you know you're operating way below the threshold of where the sound starts getting hurt by the clipper, you don't need to go back to this linking and double checking and A-Bing. You can just, move around a little bit in the range that you know is safe and isn't changing the sound in any kind of bad way. You can get your final little bit of lift here if you need to. So that's kind of the nuance at the track level. And track clipping is the harder part of clipping. It's not that hard, as you've seen, but it's something you have to think about. Every time you add new processing to the track, once you've picked an original sound and kind of, normalized it and clipped it up to fit into your mix, if you add new processing after that point, any more processors, always go back and check, am I now suddenly shooting way over 0 or way under 0? And if so, renormalize it. And then double check your clipping and say, do I still need that much clipping? Or do I need more clipping than I had before? It's all going to depend on what you do to the sound in its processing before this clip to 0 pair. Okay? Now, a little bit of an advanced trick. In DAWs like Bitwig and Ableton, it's very easy to take your clip to 0 pair and turn them into a rack that you can pull out of your library, right? So just like in Ableton and Bitwig, I would multi-select these two things and do Control-G to group them, and now I have them in a single rack that I could give a name to, my CTZ rack, and then I could turn around and save this whole thing as a preset to my library and give it a description and a name and all that stuff. And that's a convenient thing because then if I'm coming along and I have a new track and I've picked a new sound and I want to see how it works, I can just come over to my library, drag in my clip to 0 rack for tracks, and then, here's my DP meter ready to use. Here's my clipper ready to use, and I have other clippers in the same rack that I can switch between easily. And we'll talk about this particular rack and what this VCA thing is in a future episode coming up soon. Okay, that's it for today. Hope this was helpful. That's the basic idea. Now, I haven't talked much about my buses and the kind of clipping I'm doing on the buses. That's the next video. This video is focused mostly on clipping your original sounds, your original sources of new sounds, samples, synths, samplers, that kind of stuff. You want that clip to 0 pair. Don't clip it more than you need to. Readjust if you add processing. That's it in a nutshell. And I will see you in the next episode where I talk about clipping on your buses and also how to handle clipping on the aux returns and the master bus. Thanks for hanging with me.